A mother who single-handedly took down a cartel connected to her daughter's abduction and murder after authorities failed to get justice. This is the real-life version of the movie Taken, except this parent knew there was no hope of getting their child back. She simply wanted them to pay for what they had done. You are such a genuine gem. Thank you for clicking on my video. The movie Taken with Liam Neeson is child's play compared to this mama's true story, and I'm so thrilled that I came across it, that I can tell you about it, because it was in the New York Times at first, and the story was really exposed at that point. And then, because of that article, Blumhouse actually acquired the rights to create a movie based on this story, so I have all of those linked down below. But truly, I have never seen something so incredible, and it really just proves a parent's love for their children. I also want to mention our partner Geology. In a time where there is customization for your exact needs, Geology makes skincare so much easier to manage. You can take a 30-second quiz and a team of dermatologists will create your routine for you. I know how stressful it can be to try scouring the internet or stores for the best products by yourself, and Geology actually created a simple solution for that, no matter what your skincare focus is. And I have found that this Hydrogel Moisturizer is my favorite thing. It's my go-to now. It leaves you feeling so supple, and it goes on and you feel like a glazed donut, but then it sinks in. Honestly, I think my favorite thing about Geology is that you know that all the products are going to work together. That's what they're made for, and you don't have to worry about specific ingredients or be searching the internet on your perfect routine, because they have scientifically created it for you. It's the perfect place to start with skincare or to start over if you are overwhelmed and struggling. Another one of my favorites, the sunscreen. Doesn't burn your eyes, which is a huge factor. So I'm going to continue getting ready, but I wanted to let you guys know that if you use my code Brooke Mckenna 70 or use the QR code on the screen, you can actually get 70% off their award-winning skincare trial set. And on top of that, they're giving you 30% off if you add on one of their hair, skin, or body products. Let's get back to the story. So it was 2012 when Karen Alejandra Salinas Rodriguez disappeared in Mexico. She had stayed in her hometown to finish school and to also help her mother Miriam to run their little shop that they had called Rodeo Boots, which had cowboy apparel and things like that. But Karen was also taking care of the family home while her mother was away in Texas, where her mother would actually go and make money as a nanny sometimes. And Karen also had a brother named Louis, though he had moved away from the family due to fear of danger in the area, and this wasn't unwarranted paranoia either. So on January 23rd of 2012, Karen would be driving through San Fernando, which is where they lived, and she would be merging into traffic. And suddenly, two trucks pulled up beside her, blocked her in on both sides, and armed men would force her into their car before speeding off with her. Now, she wouldn't be the only one who vanished that day, though. You see, while Karen was in Mexico and her mother and brother were not in the area, her uncle, as well as her older sister Azalea, did live nearby. In fact, they would all share the family truck together, and this truck needed some car maintenance. So when Karen was taken back to her family home after she was abducted, she was bound and gagged by her kidnappers, and then there was a knock on the door. Karen's uncle had actually asked his mechanic friend to come over and work on the truck. And so this mechanic had showed up at the home, and he was taken captive as well. The kidnappers then left the area with both victims. Now, this wasn't breaking news, especially in Mexico, and it was so common that almost nobody noticed, except, of course, for their families. Her mother, Miriam Elizabeth Rodriguez Martinez, was obviously devastated, but she couldn't just sit and wait for Mexican investigators to do something, especially because she knew that they were likely to not do anything. Miriam and the rest of Karen's family spent the next few weeks gathering all of the information they could, being their own investigators. They launched their own investigation, and soon enough, they did have suspects. However, this wasn't one individual or a few that had worked together. This was an entire Mexican cartel. They were known as the Los Zetas. Now, they were formed by former Special Forces soldiers. It was a group known to kidnap innocents for ransom, and they had come to the area back in 2004. The family was pretty certain that their daughter had been abducted by this cartel, and sure enough, the family began to receive phone calls demanding money for the return of Karen. Now, they would have paid any amount of money for this sweet girl. In fact, Miriam went to the bank and took out a loan to pay this, and so then they followed the instructions on this ransom note, and it directed them to a health clinic where they would drop off the bag of money. And then they were said to go to the local cemetery where they would then be given Karen. Karen's father ended up doing all of this and being the one that was supposed to get Karen back, and he impatiently waited for Karen's return at the cemetery, but she wasn't there, and then the money was gone. After this, Miriam decided she was going to talk to her daughter's abductors face to face, and she asked to meet with a cartel member. And then one would agree to this. And so they showed up at El Junior, a local restaurant, and Miriam described him as a slender young man. When they had their meeting, Miriam would only know his name due to the radio he had on his hip, constantly speaking while they were talking and calling his name Sama. And so that is when Miriam learned that Sama didn't actually know, or said he didn't know, any information about her daughter. However, he, for a price, would help her find her. This was for a fee of $2,000, and getting Miriam's hopes up once again, she paid this fee, $2,000, to Sama. Unfortunately, nothing came of this, and whether Sama actually searched or knew about Karen's whereabouts was a mystery at this point. He stopped answering her phone calls after a week, but he also didn't know that Miriam had caught his name over this radio when they were together and knew who he was. Miriam, though, began to face the great possibility that her daughter was already deceased, and that is why her attempts to pay the demand failed to return her every single time. Once Miriam had even paid $500 to callers who claimed that they were the kidnappers, that they would return Karen, she knew it was most likely a hoax, but she tried it anyway. A few weeks after she had paid this and there was no payoff, she told her other daughter, Azalea, that she knew Karen was never coming home. Azalea would say later that her mother spoke to her so matter of fact, but this wasn't because Miriam was giving up. It was because she had a plan. You see, once Miriam knew the name of this cartel member, she was able to confirm that he was one of the kidnappers. This was due to the man, the mechanic, that had been abducted after Karen. You see, the kidnappers had let him go. He wasn't part of the original plan, and so he had eventually been released, and he would end up telling Miriam everything that happened that day, and he would confirm that Sama was one of the kidnappers. Azalea, Miriam's other daughter, would claim that her mother completely changed after this and she would never be the same again. Miriam promised that she would not be resting until all of the kidnappers were found. She was going to hunt every single one of them down, one by one, until they were either in jail or deceased. She was going to get justice for her daughter, and Miriam began to look up names and addresses for every member of the Zetas. But at this point, she only had one name. And so she had to use all of her resources for that one name, hoping that others would be connected. That is when she ended up going on Facebook and searching Sama's name, and then she would find his online profile. Through his page, she found a friend of his who was photographed wearing this specific uniform for an ice cream store that was about 2 hours away. So she spent weeks staking out this store until Sama turned up. And then when Sama finally got there and eventually left, Miriam was right behind him, following him home. You see, she didn't know exactly where Sama lived yet and believed that his home could lead her to more members. This is exactly where Sama would lead her, except Miriam feared that he would recognize her, and so Miriam didn't just change her mindset at this point, she disguised herself too. She cut and dyed her hair bright red and posed as different characters so that she could get information when she returned to the area without being suspicious. She used fake IDs, she bought a gun, and she got to work. She even dressed as an election official at one point so she could go from neighbor to neighbor claiming to be conducting a poll to gather information. None of the information that she was finding was just handed to this grieving mother. She started with neighbors, then she went to distant relatives, creating reasons to meet up and ask them unsuspecting questions, all because she knew if they suspected her, she would be killed. At this point, members of the Zetas cartel were said to be leaving the cartel and simply vanishing after realizing how serious Miriam was about finding them, about getting justice. Some were said to become cab drivers, others were car salesmen, others were nannies. They were all just hiding. This mother had them in fear. But with the help of a federal police commander who remains anonymous, one by one, these men were being hunted. This commander was actually amazed by the work that Miriam had already done all by herself, because Miriam had also documented everything. So after years, Miriam finally had help by law enforcement, because the commander said that Miriam had gone to every single level of government and they had slammed the door in her face. He said to help Miriam hunt down and look for the people who took her daughter was the greatest privilege of his career. So at this point, an arrest warrant was finally issued for Sama. However, he had left town by this point. There would be a lucky break in the case on September 15th of 2014 when Miriam's son and Karen's brother Louis spotted Sama back in town at his store helping a customer. Louis ended up calling the police and trailed him while he was walking away from his store, and Sama would finally be caught and arrested. While being questioned, surprisingly, he broke and he ended up giving names of other cartel members. And suddenly these men that he knew and named were talking about what happened to Karen. And it would lead Miriam and the police to an 18-year-old named Christian Jose Zapata Gonzalez. And he was only 18 years old. He was said to be scared. He wanted his mother and he was hungry. And so Miriam actually entered the room and brought him some food. And that's when he would end up talking. So 2 years after Karen's abduction in 2014, it was explained in a confession that there was a ranch where she was killed. Now, investigators were taken by the suspects to this ranch and Miriam tagged along. And after a search of the property, they found bullet holes in the walls, many of them, and evidence believed to be connected to Karen was located. You see, a cushion from what was believed to be her truck was found, and Miriam also found a scarf on the property that she confirmed was Karen's. But this wasn't the worst part, because Karen's femur bones were located. But even after finding Karen's remains, Miriam told her loved ones that nothing would ever be normal for her again. And the hunt was not over. For the next 3 years, Miriam traveled across Mexico on a mission. She became a human rights defender and also led an organization called the Collective of the Disappeared. And this was comprised of 600 families who were looking for their missing relatives in Mexico. Because as New York Times explained in their article, the San Fernando area in Mexico was a scary place. There were shootouts, there were mass graves, and it was so common that the news wouldn't even report on it if it had less than 20 victims involved. The Zetas were not helping the violence either, and they were kidnapping. They were holding their victims captive for ransom and also sometimes having them fight to the death just for sport. In fact, 2 years before Karen's abduction, in 2010, 72 bodies, which was 58 men and 14 women, were found on a different ranch in San Fernando's outskirts. They were immigrants trying to make it to the United States, which were actually usual victims of the cartel. And a survivor had actually made it to the border and had escaped this. And he would tell police that he was in a room of 72 bodies piled on top of each other, and that the killers were the Zetas. He said that they were all blindfolded, told to lie face down and be quiet, and that is when they started shooting. And he actually had a bullet to the back, but he had played dead, and then he escaped, and he made it to the border. Investigators would later confirm that they had found the motive for these 72 deaths to be the refusal to work for the cartel. And then a year before Karen's abduction in 2011, bus riders believed to be immigrants in the San Fernando area were being abducted at such a fast rate, and 200 bodies would be found in a mass grave. Now, this was after the leader of the mass murder of the 72 bodies a year prior was caught by federal police. Edgar Huerta Montiel confessed that the Zetas believed that the immigrants would be recruited by a rival gang, and that's why they wanted to get to them first. So he was a member of the Zetas, and he was confessing that they were involved in both of these. That same year, 81 members of the Zetas were detained for the massacre of the 72 bodies. However, they were not ever said to be sentenced. This wasn't surprising to any residents in Mexico because of the pure negligence of the police and the many cover-ups that are said to occur. And this was actually said to be proven because in a shocking and very uncommon move, the Attorney General's office declassified documents of confessions related to these cases. And so the public got to hear that it was claimed by many members of the Zetas that the local San Fernando police were helping the Los Zetas by working as lookouts. They were turning a blind eye, they were intercepting people, and they were also paid to deliver prisoners. The declassified memo also claimed that 18 local police officers were being investigated. Though even though these things were released and certain people were said to be arrested and held accountable at first, there is no trace of it actually going through the justice system. So in San Fernando, Mexico, there was no escaping the risk of danger around every corner, especially with the decade-long drug war between these cartel factions. Going against any cartels in Mexico was a dangerous mission, and Miriam knew that there would be consequences. But this did not stop her. And in fact, there was a neighbor of the ranch where Karen's remains were found that Miriam believed knew something. And this was a woman named Elvia Bintacourt who claimed that she hadn't even heard about Karen's disappearance, even though it was, definitely local news. And so Miriam then discovered that this woman was dating one of Karen's kidnappers. And to prove this, she staked out the prison where this kidnapper was held for another charge, not Karen's abduction or murder. And this woman, Elvia, showed up to see him. After that, Elvia was arrested. And that is when the police found that ransom calls to Miriam were made from her home. Another one of the cartel members believed to be involved in Karen's abduction was found by Miriam inside of a chapel. This man's own mother had told Miriam that he had always been in trouble, but at least now he was going to church. So she started going to that church, and Enrique Flores was arrested. And that is when the congregation began to protest this, and Miriam was asking them where all that compassion was when her daughter was abducted. And she continued the hunt regardless of the backlash. So for all of these years, she continued to just look for different people to find information, and doing this practically all on her own, except for the help of one person in law enforcement. And from her investigative skills, in 2017, Miriam found that the local florist in the area had joined the Los Zetas, but after Karen's kidnapping, had disappeared, panicked, and was on the run. To make money, though, she found that he was now selling flowers across the border. Miriam tracked him down. However, this florist was said to start running from her, and this 56-year-old mother didn't let that stop her from getting justice. She ran after him, she tracked him down, she put a gun up to him, and said that she would shoot if he moved. She then called the police and held him captive there for an hour so that they could get there. This florist was actually the last of the 10 members that Miriam had helped to take down. This was believed to be everyone involved in her daughter's kidnapping and murder. We don't have the information on all 10, not that I could find, but 10 people were said to be brought to justice because of this mother. However, that same year, the cartel had enough. They began to go after Miriam, who was asking the government for protection. She did receive some, though she hadn't asked for her safety. She mainly asked because she wanted to continue to fight for justice for other families, because she would often say, "I died the day they killed my daughter. I want to end this. I'm going to take out the people who hurt my daughter, and they can do whatever they want to me." And then in March of 2017, 29 inmates at Ciudad Victoria had escaped after digging a tunnel to the outside, and this was the very prison that Miriam had sent her daughter's killers. Unfortunately, Miriam would be shot in front of her home on May 10th, which was Mother's Day in Mexico, and her husband ran outside to find her face down in the street. Her arm was actually in her purse, reaching for her pistol, and Miriam was said to be in a very vulnerable position at this point anyway, because she had broken her foot while chasing the florist and getting him to go to jail, so she couldn't get away fast when the shootout began, and the inmates were said to pull up and shoot her around 12 times. This was heartbreaking for her husband because he had actually become a recluse after Karen's death. He often did not leave the home, and so Miriam's death was said to completely break him. After Miriam's murder, the Center for Justice and International Law called for Mexican authorities to not let this case go unpunished too. As they stated, many Mexican human rights groups have found that families searching for justice are often also killed while doing so. This included Gerardo Corona Pinchino, who was also killed that same year in 2017. In fact, he was killed only a month prior to Miriam, on April 19th, 2017. You see, Gerardo had been investigating his brother's disappearance, Alvaro, who had disappeared the same year as Karen in 2012. Gerardo was also very vocal about his fight for his brother, and he believed that his disappearance occurred due to organized crime and the fact that Alvaro didn't want to work for them. So a month before Miriam's death, Gerardo was shot outside of his home after asking for state protection and not receiving it. Strangely enough, though, there were said to be phone calls that Gerardo had recorded when he was looking for information on his brother, and these were said to have confessions that the person who actually ordered the killing of his brother worked in the local government. However, Miriam and Gerardo weren't the only family members killed for speaking out. There was also Jose Jesus Jimenez in 2016, so a year prior. And Jose's daughter Jenny had disappeared in May of 2011. Jose had actually joined the National Search Brigade for the disappeared people, hoping to find her. And then Jose was driving with his wife when he was shot 3 times, and Jenny has still not been found. And so there was a lot of pressure on Mexican authorities at this time after so many family members of missing and murdered people who were looking for justice were then killed. And then Miriam, who was very, very outspoken, was murdered as well. There was so much pressure on authorities to actually promise to catch the killers, and so they did. And it was said that 2 of Miriam's killers were arrested. Another was killed in a gunfight, though I could not find names and any more information on that. But because of this pressure, the police began to use Miriam's research that she had collected over the years to catch one of Karen's other kidnappers. This was actually a woman who had tortured Karen and had hung her up like a boxing bag, and then this woman had fled the area. But the police had found her a month after Miriam was murdered. And that was all because of Miriam and her work. But after her death, the collective for the disappeared was taken over by her son, Louis, and they released a statement saying, "In this dark night of violence and terror that we have experienced for more than a decade in the northeast of the country, and which has unfortunately spread through Mexican territory, is that impunity, the total absence of the rule of law, has allowed a system of terror and death as a form of government to come into effect in our states." A state official told the New York Times that not everyone got along with Miriam, but everyone respected what she was doing. A bronze plaque was actually placed in the Central Plaza to honor her, but just when the city of San Fernando was said to get a moment of peace after all of this, because there was so much attention on the Mexican authorities because of Miriam, it didn't last long. On July 8th of 2020, very recently, another young kidnap victim was abducted for ransom. This was a 14-year-old Luciano Leao Garcia. And it turned out that Luciano was lured into this trap. You see, a few weeks prior to the abduction, a young girl, or who he believed to be a young girl, started messaging him on Facebook that she wanted to meet. And eventually, they set a location at this local park. And so, Luciano had drove his family's truck there and immediately got taken upon arrival. Then his family would receive a call from the kidnappers, and Luciano was put on the phone. He appeared to be okay, but the only thing he wanted to know is if his 2 sisters were safe, that he actually left home alone when he went to meet this girl. But then the captors demanded money, and just like in Karen's case, his family paid multiple ransoms and did not get their son back. Now, Luciano's family had experience with kidnappings and ransom because Luciano's father had actually once been held captive for 33 days and the ransom was paid, so he got to return home. So they had a lot of hope that the ransom would ensure that their son was coming back, but he didn't. And these parents wanted to be very outspoken about getting their son back, and they were pleading with the kidnappers on the news, but they also knew what would happen if they pushed the cartel too far. They had just watched it happen to Miriam, and so they really held back on what they said and did. Now, it was later found by police that Luciano's mother's cousins had joined the cartel, and they extorted the family with this kidnapping. Except that didn't mean that Luciano would be sent back to his family, because his body was then found. So all of this is still happening today. The kidnappings, the murders, the mass executions, the police negligence, the injustice, the silencing. It's a terrifying reality for Mexico. These cartels are ruling Mexico. And with having the Mexican police allegedly involved with the cartels, they are literally trying to find help, these citizens, by just doing it themselves. They're trying to get justice by fighting on their own, by coming together as a community, instead of being able to rely on the people who were supposed to do that as their job. What a mother Miriam is and was, and even though she knew that this was most likely going to end in her murder, it's still heartbreaking. But I am happy to hear that the police did look into her research and at least appear to have arrested one more person, meaning that maybe they're still looking into the case and trying to do what they didn't do for all those years, actually investigate. But I can't imagine the amount of fear that these Mexican citizens, especially in San Fernando, are feeling, and just knowing that they're so silenced. And when they try to speak out, they know what that means for their future. Miriam fought so hard, so loudly, because she knew that that was how it was going to end for her. She had accepted that, and that was the only way that she could be so outspoken and receive justice, is that she knew her fate. But that should not be what their fate is in Mexico to get justice. These abductions, these mass executions, these citizens being forced to work for the cartel, or if not, they're killed. It's a terrifying situation. And if you know more, if you maybe live in Mexico, if you have family members there, please let me know if there is anything that we can do, anything we can discuss more of, any information that I didn't have, that I can't find on the internet, maybe that the people are trying to spread awareness about, but it's not, being vocalized because they can't do it. Please let me know. I would love to be a voice for the people who continue to be silenced. It's not fair. It's not right. And it has to stop. Have you watched the movie Taken with Liam Neeson? I feel like most of you probably have, but it's one of my all-time favorite movies. My dad and I would watch it growing up, and I just always knew that my dad would do the very same thing that Liam Neeson did in that movie if I had been kidnapped. And it's just, it shows the incredible love that parents have for their children, and truly the sacrifices they will make. I'm sure that Karen knew that she was loved in this life, but I really hope that she got to see what her mother did for her afterwards and how much she fought for her, because it's absolutely beautiful. But don't forget to speak up. Your voice is powerful enough, and I love you to absolute pieces. Okay, bye.